Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I am your host, Brooke Mitchell, and today's webinar is Photographing Wildflowers in Yellowstone and Grand Teton, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader and Pro Photographer Charlie Reinertsen. Thank you so much for being here today, Charlie. Over to you.
Thank you and welcome everyone. I'm excited to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, wildflowers, and in one of my favorite places, the Tetons and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So just a little bit about me, we'll start there and then we'll dive into the greater Yellowstone ecosystem as a whole. And we'll talk about wildflowers, when you can see them and how to photograph them. And at the very end, we'll take a quick look at a trip itinerary for the hidden Yellowstone and Grand Teton wildlife safari that is offered with Natural Habitat Adventures. And I was just out in Grand Teton and Yellowstone guiding back-to-back trips, and we had some really beautiful wildflower conditions in the valley, and so really nice time out there. And so I'll be able to talk a little bit about what's happening out there right now. Just a little bit about me. My background is in science communications, and I've worked in writing and photography, working with magazines and land conservation groups, and also designing exhibits for trying to get people connected to the natural world and get interested in trying to conserve it and find ways to protect it. Working with Natural Habitat Adventures is one of the really joyful parts of my year. I guide about 3 to 4 trips down in Michoacan, Mexico for the monarch butterfly migration, obviously Grand Teton and Yellowstone. And this fall, I'll be adding on the Acadia and coastal Maine experience. And it's one of my favorite things because getting out with guests and getting to share these places that I love and that I'm so connected to, and to see others kind of see the beauty that I'm seeing in these places is just really exciting. So I love being an expedition leader for Natural Habitat Adventures, and part of that pride has a lot to do with the partnership with World Wildlife Fund, and knowing that wherever we travel is always going to feed the local economy and also give back to the ecology of the area and make sure that these places are still here for us to enjoy in the future. So let's dive into the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which includes Grand Teton National Park, Yellowstone National Park, and then a much larger geographic area surrounding that. And it's one of our last intact ecosystems with a full array of prey and predator species so that we can see what happens when ecosystems are mostly intact. A lot of people are visiting Yellowstone and Grand Teton to be able to see these iconic landscapes that are just these vast mountainous expanses and valleys. They're also going to see the geothermal features, which are a product of the hot spot in Yellowstone, where magma is closer to Earth's surface than it is anywhere else in the world other than an actively erupting volcano. And they're also going to visit this area because of the charismatic megafauna. You get to see so many different species, from elk to wolves to bear, grizzly and black bear. And it's just a pretty magical place where you get to picture what it must have been like across the whole country, and when ecosystems were intact across that whole expanse. And if you time it right, you have the opportunity to see some pretty spectacular wildflower displays. Right here, we're taking a look at one of my favorite species to photograph, and just one of my favorite ecological happenings in Grand Teton National Park, and that's the arrowleaf balsamroot flower that we're seeing here, this yellow Asteraceae sunflower family. And this flower at certain times of the year is going to blanket the valley floor, and at certain elevations at certain times. And if for me, it's a really fun flower to try and integrate the landscape into the composition. So with this shot in particular, I got really lucky with this storm front that was moving in across the Tetons in the background, and then the lighting just so happened to be really even, but also giving enough light to these flowers in the foreground to be able to capture this photo. Um, so before we dive into kind of looking at specific photos and talking about different techniques, uh, a lot of wildlife photography just comes down to the basics of where and when is it happening. And then when you get there, it's a really fun, to me, it's a fun subject because they're not going anywhere. If you can time it right and you're physically there, you can spend as much time as you want taking different types of photos, trying to look at different light conditions, uh, different weather conditions, whether there's moisture or if it's just rained or it's raining. You can create different effects. So the basic where and when in Grand Teton, you're looking at low elevation wildflower blooms starting in early June. You might even get it at late May. I was there this year at the end of May, first week of June, and the wildflowers in the valley at the end of May were all present. Everybody was accounted for that you would expect at that season, all the different species of wildflowers. But when we came back on the second trip in early June, that was when you started to see just the flowers erupting, whole fields of different types of flowers. But it's one of those things that is very geographically specific. You'll have tiny pockets where the conditions are just right with enough sunshine, enough warmth, enough moisture that the flowers will erupt in that little location. So, with photography, sometimes you plan shots in advance and you think, I want this exact composition of the mountains in the background from this location, and I'm going to wait until the flowers bloom in this spot, and I want this type of light, so I'm going to go back day after day until I get it. Or you're just opportunistic. Hopefully, you're there in the right moment to be able to capture a really nice shot. In for the low elevation areas in Yellowstone tends to be just a little bit behind Grand Teton, but again, it all depends on where you are. That's just because generally Yellowstone's a little bit higher elevation when it comes to the valley floor. So that's kind of going to be June, July, but we saw a lot of great wildflowers that first week of June this year. And then obviously the wildflower bloom is going to start at low elevations where it's warmer sooner. And then the bloom will kind of move up in elevation. So you'll actually see some of these flowers almost causing this uh, like a shift in, if you could just take arrowleaf balsamroot, you can kind of see it blooming on the hillsides as it goes higher up every day in a given week that the bloom is starting to go. For some reason, that was much harder to explain than I anticipated, but thanks for your patience. And so the cool thing about wildflowers is that if you're willing to hike or travel to different elevations, you can kind of find them all the way until September, October. We have some wildflowers that are just going to bloom in that season. So anytime in the growing season, you can see wildflowers, but for me personally, and a lot of the photos I'm going to share today, these flowers are really going to peak that first and second week of June in the valley floor. One of the things that I really encourage people to do, for me, photography is a way of learning about the world. So often I'm going to take a picture of something and that's going to spur me to then learn about that thing. So after I edit the photo, then it's like, okay, what is this? Let me identify it. Let me learn more about it. And then often that kind of has this cyclical process for me where once I learn more about something, then it's like, oh, I have a new perspective on how to photograph that. And its life cycle or things about its structure that are more interesting than other plants or different. And so it makes me want to photograph them more once I get a little bit more knowledge. And for me, this dichotomous key, guidebooks, phone apps, that's the order of importance that I place on how to do this. So if I really want to remember a plant, I'm going to use a dichotomous key. And if you're not familiar with them, basically what they are, they're books. You probably can also get them on apps, but I'm a big fan of physical books because it triggers memory in a different way. But using a dichotomous key, you start on the first page, and it's a series of questions. And based on your answer, it's going to tell you what page to jump to. So it's kind of like a choose your own adventure book, but for plants. So, for example, it would say, uh, does the flower have uh, alternate leaves or opposing leaves? If it's opposing, go to page 24. And then it'll say, does it have 3 petals or 5 petals? If it's 5, go to page 48. And you just keep going and you answer all the questions. And by the time you get to the end, you've got down to a species. And why that's, for me, that's really helpful in triggering memory because it puts that plant in relation to other plants. Because as you're getting closer and closer, you're starting to identify, oh, it's in this genus, and then oh, it's this specific species within that genus. So you start to see relationships. And if you're not familiar with scientific names, they're separated into 2 names, genus and species. And it's kind of like family order, the different groupings of life on Earth that we've created for their relationships to one another. So big fan of dichotomous keys. If you've never used one, it's pretty fun. And the only thing that you need to brush up on or learn, and usually in the very front of the dichotomous key, it's going to give you some very basic plant anatomy. So it's going to tell you, all right, here's what a petal looks like. Here's the sepal, which is the covering of the flower. It'll give you a few different terms that you're going to use as you navigate that book. Guidebooks are great as well. Some of them that I really like are going to be organized by color. So you literally, here are all the white flowers, here are all the pink flowers and the purple flowers. And so you just kind of flip to that section and look for the thing that looks closest to what you're looking at, and then get down to the description of the plant that says, here's the identifying characteristic of this particular plant. Does it have, 5 sepals? And so for me, those 2 things are going to help me remember. But phone apps are getting really, really good at identifying plants. It's just for me personally, I'll never remember something that I'm exclusively using my phone to look up unless I spend a lot of time just trying to push it into my brain. But that's just how my brain works. Your brain might be better than mine. So you might be able to just use apps such as iNaturalist, which they use Seek. Seek is the app, Seek. Download that on your phone, and then you can just use your camera to take a picture and it'll identify the species. And they're getting incredibly accurate. There's no problem with the accuracy of them. It's just whether or not it's triggering a mental pathway for you if learning these plants is important. So a couple things. Why are flowers important? What's the ecological role that they're occupying? For me as a photographer, I really start from this place. I want to understand what I'm seeing, and that'll inform how I approach the photography. Uh, so one piece of importance is that flower is an essential part of the reproductive cycle of that plant. Obviously, they're uh, you know producing pollen, and that pollen is pollinating the flowers and literally creating the next generation of that flower. Uh, the other ecological importance of that is that because they're flowering and because they reproduce sexually instead of asexual reproduction, they're recombining their genetics through sexual pollination, and it's recombining their DNA in a way that creates unique individuals. Whereas if you have asexual reproduction, you're cloning, creating a genetic identical individual. A lot of plants will do this by simply sending up new stems from their roots. You'll see this with aspen. Aspen's actually a superorganism of all the things that we think of as trees are actually just part of a larger whole that's all connected by roots. And in that instance, they're reproducing asexually, so they have less genetic diversity. They're genetically identical, and that makes them a little bit more susceptible to disease, to change. And so, flowers, this huge investment. You think about plants, they're investing all this energy in creating this structure that's exclusively for reproduction. And sometimes that is incredibly elaborate. So they're putting a lot of energy into this structure that's not going to last all that long. And it's all geared towards being able to create unique individuals that have greater genetic diversity that might be able to help the population flourish moving forward. The other thing that wildflowers are doing is they're an incredibly important food source for pollinators as well as other animals that are going to eat the whole flower or a part of the plant. And like all plants, they're also providing really good erosion control. So their roots are going to help hold together the soil and protect the soil. You're probably hearing about one of the crises that we have is our shrinking topsoil. So having diverse native species on hillsides and in as much habitat as possible is going to make sure that in these big flooding events, which are becoming more frequent, that we're going to hold on to our topsoil. So a little bit of their evolutionary history. Flowers have adapted and evolved to have a number of different reproductive strategies. They require pollination some of them require pollination to reproduce. So moving pollen from one flower onto another flower to be able to fertilize the ovary of that flower and then create the seed for the next plant. And this can be done by a number of different ways, whether it's by wind, by insect pollination, by mammal pollination. There's so many different forms. And flowers kind of fall into two big categories. They're either generalists or specialists. And just like the name would suggest, a specialist is going to focus on one particular type of pollinator, such as a bee. One particular bee is going to be attracted to this very specific flower, and it will solely be responsible for pollinating that flower. And we have a lot of great examples of this in the orchid family of flowers. And it's often what's driving really spectacular colors or physiology, so actual structures on the flower that are pretty amazing. And that's an example of coevolution, or where the flower will evolve to attract a particular individual, and the individual will evolve, alongside each other so that it's perfectly pollinating that plant and also providing a benefit to the pollinator. So now we'll dive into some specific examples, and I'll talk about photography techniques that I tend to like. And this is a very stylistic thing. Some people are really interested in creating, a really good scientific representation of a flower. So they're wanting everything to be in focus. They want to isolate the background. For me, I'm more interested in kind of capturing the feeling of what it was like to see that flower, and maybe highlighting one of the characteristics of that flower. For this picture in particular, this is a pasqueflower, and these flowers are very, very hairy. So botanists are one of my favorite ecologists because they come up with all these different names for characteristics of flowers. So this particular kind of hair on this particular kind of flower is referred to as pubescence, and it kind of provides herbivory protection. So trying to create a barrier that is harder for insects and different animals to be able to eat the flowers. So the other thing it's going to do, because these are often found at pretty high elevations, is and also in arid climates, really dry, the hair is going to create this boundary layer that actually will keep this plant insulated, both from the cold and from the heat. So it's kind of like wearing this coat to be able to make sure that the surface temperature of the plant doesn't get as hot. And a lot of plants in dry conditions are doing everything they can to hold on to the moisture that they do have uh, because it's such a limiting factor. And the other aspect of this from a photography standpoint is that I'm using a really shallow depth of field. So f-stop on this photo is 2.8, which is very wide open. So you're creating this bokeh effect. So it's really a nice color wash behind what's in focus. Here you're getting a look at not only is the petal of the flower having those hairs, that pubescence, also the sepal of the flower, this protective covering around the petals. It also has that pubescence, so it's a highly hairy flower. So you know it's trying to hold on to moisture and prevent herbivory. And the other factor why they're trying to prevent herbivory is that if an insect eats a petal or even the whole flower of that plant, uh, a number of things happen that's detrimental to their reproductive cycle. But in all of those tissues, they're holding moisture. So by an insect eating that tissue, it's actually taking away a lot of the moisture and nutrients that that plant needs to be able to survive. Here we have sticky geranium, another flower that you'll actually see kind of throughout the whole wildflower season. I find like you can always find these blooming, and I really love these the pink striations that come through the petals. So I was trying to highlight that here. And then this was right after a rain, so you've got some nice droplets on the flower. This picture, I like it, but there's some technical things that I wish the depth of field was a little bit better. Maybe less clear focus. I think the leaves on the left are a little bit distracting for the eye. So it's not my favorite picture, but it was one of my better ones of geraniums. So I thought I'd include that. Here is one of my favorite flowers. This is a spring beauty. And spring beauties have a really fun ecological story because they produce what's called a corym underground. And it's this little starchy deposit that has a lot of carbohydrates, and a lot of animals will dig these up and eat them. And this picture makes them seem much bigger than they are. They're actually the size of the end of your pinky, the flower itself. And grizzly bears and black bears will actually go into fields of spring beauty when they're blooming and dig all of them up and eat all of the corym. Uh, and it's just kind of an amazing thing that such a large animal could rely on such a tiny organism for sustenance at that time. Another thing that can help with memory, if you're trying to remember plants and put them in your brain, I find two different things help. One of them would be to kind of create a book where you press samples of flowers. Obviously, you can't take samples from national parks, but if you're on private land or state land, depending on the regulations, you might be able to harvest a flower. So you can create a flower press and use a little bit of glue to be able to put that in a notebook and create a little write-up on it. You could write this up instead of typing, but it helps you, I did this when I was a graduate student as part of a class, but it did really help, lock this species into my brain. So you're actually getting a look at the whole specimen all the way down to the root, which is helpful as well. And here's just a side by side. That's a bear cub. That picture was taken in July in Yellowstone, but with one of their favorite springtime foods. Here is an invasive species in Yellowstone. This is that same bear family of this individual, mama and her cub right here in a field of clover, and that's an invasive species, so it's not native, but the animals do enjoy feeding on that as well. And it's always fun when you get a chance to be able to photograph bears in the wild, and occasionally they'll be, close enough to the vehicle to be able to get some great shots. All right, so this one is green gentian, and I really wanted this flower itself is a monument plant, so all of these flowers are off of this central kind of tower. Uh, and this particular plant, it only blooms once every 100 years or so. So it can sit dormant in the ground until the conditions are absolutely perfect. And then at that point, it'll bloom. And I really like how on this image, the whole flower, individual flower, is very much in focus. And then it's kind of an even loss of focus around the outside without too many distracting factors. I really enjoy natural light for my photography. I'm trying to use as little flash as possible or not at all, because I find it kind of it's very hard to make it feel natural once you introduce unnatural light, and a lot of the reflective portions of a plant can kind of, wash out in the image. It might be that I'm not as technically advanced on the lighting side of things, but I also just enjoy kind of the ephemeral moment of trying to get the right lighting and be in the right moment to be able to get a picture. This is lupine. Lupine is really special for the ecosystem because it's a nitrogen fixer. There's a lot of nitrogen in the air, in a form that's not accessible to most plants. And so the legume family of plants has the ability to fix nitrogen. So they're actually taking that nitrous oxide and being able to transition it into a physical compound. And they are able to do that in their root system. And that makes it available in the soil to other plants as well. And I love this picture for the softness that it has. There's enough in focus to be able to see detail, but then quite a bit of it is out of focus to be able to just give you color wash behind. Um, and this is lupin in another ecosystem, and this is where introduction of species can go awry. This is taken in Iceland, where lupin was introduced. It's not native, or this species is not native there. And it was introduced to try and prevent erosion on roadsides, and it's completely taken over a lot of hillsides and mountainsides. And so here you're seeing just fields and fields of lupin. It's doing the job of preventing erosion, but it's created this secondary issue of kind of taking over in different areas. And here's that same shot that we saw in the beginning, but here's a closer up shot just of the arrowleaf balsamroot. This one I was using a slower shutter speed, so you're actually it's handheld, and I kind of like that for the movement that it created and kind of blurred different areas of this. And then if you look at the very bottom of this image, there's a purple flower, and that's a larkspur, one of my other favorite flowers that I don't think I have too many good shots here. But occasionally on trips you get moments like this. This is a really shaky video from a spotting scope, but it does show you the kinds of compositions that you could possibly come across, where you've got arrowleaf balsam root in the foreground, just fields and fields of it, and a mother and her cub playing in the background. And if you're familiar with Grand Teton National Park's bears, you've definitely heard about. This is 399. Unfortunately, was killed in a vehicle wildlife collision last year, and she was really famous for raising her cubs along roadsides because it was a strategy for her to avoid male grizzly bears who don't like to be near people, but who do like to try and kill cubs of females so that they become available to mate with and have their own cubs. So a little bit of a sad piece of their ecological story, but you can also see in this video it's just pouring rain. So it made it really dark conditions to try and get photography, and I didn't have my long lens at the time. But I'm really, that moment of being able to watch that was just really spectacular. And a last little anecdote about this interaction is that she's had, multiple cubs at once. At one point, she was raising 3 cubs. This particular season, she only had 1 cub. That was her, I think, her last season raising cubs. And it was interesting. A lot of the photographers who follow her, every day they're out looking for her, and they were saying that she was playing with her cub a lot more, and that's how they learn their life skills is through play. Whereas when she had 3 cubs, they would kind of entertain themselves, and she was a little bit more aloof. But with this particular cub, toward the end of her life, she was really playful and really engaged with that cub. So this is a flower that I just love. This is called prairie smoke. And it just has a really interesting nodding. Nodding is a downward facing flower structure. So on the left, you're seeing the flower, and on the right, you're seeing what it looks like when it goes to seed. So it's a wind dispersed seed. And so it has these big structures that will help carry those seeds and disperse them further. And in the background of the picture on the left, you're seeing arrowleaf balsamroot again, just from another angle. And we were talking earlier about orchids being a species that, or a group of species that is highly specialized. And they have these very unique structures that are really extravagant. And you can find orchids all over the world. And people have created photography careers just photographing orchids and the diversity of orchids. And this one, fairy slipper, is a really beautiful one that's very rare to find. You really have to be looking in the woods in particular areas to be able to find it. And it just has this really unique, interesting opening where that yellow structure is where the pollen is. So as the pollinator goes into that gap to be able to get down to the nectar, it's actually picking up the pollen on those anthers. And this flower is in the primrose family, but it's a shooting star is the common name. And it's another one that you'll see blanketing hillsides. We were really lucky to time this in Yellowstone on the northern entrance. There was this one hillside just covered in shooting stars, which is a really unique flower and one that I'd like to spend a little bit more time photographing. So just a couple, things that I think about to kind of round this out. I really try to use natural light because I find that flash is going to create some reflective surfaces on flowers, but some really talented people have integrated flash into their photography and with flowers and have it's made a really big difference. Sometimes you're in a dark forest and there's just not enough light to be able to capture what you want. The other thing that I'm really thinking about is using a macro lens that's going to allow you to get really close to your subject and make it larger than life and create a really shallow depth of field. I tend to like that visually quite a bit. And then for me, a big decision is what part of the flower you want in focus, because a lot of times there's a lot of 3-dimensional structure to them. And if you're using a shallow depth of field and you're close up, you're going to be putting a lot of the flower out of focus. and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And really, for me, photography is just about playing around and playing with all the variables and trying to get to a result that you're happy with. Another thing that I'll do pretty often is use a really long lens to get close up to a flower, because it'll actually compress depth. It'll make things appear closer than they are. And sometimes that can create a unique or nice effect as well. And then obviously getting into that wide angle, getting really close to your subject, but then having a wide angle to be able to get the context of where your subject is another strategy that I use quite a bit. So just giving a couple examples here. On the top left is a macro shot. So you have a lens that allows you to get really close to that flower. On the right top is that wide angle lens where I'm probably only 2 feet from that cluster of arrowleaf balsamroot, but I was with a 20 millimeter lens on that one. So it gave me a nice sweeping perspective. And then down here with this moth, using a telephoto lens to be able to get closer to that wildlife than I could as it was drinking the nectar from a twin berry. Yeah, and just another step of learning about these flowers would be, even if you're terrible at sketching, it can be a way to really engage your mental pathways to be able to help remember. Flower press, obviously, and try not to rely on phone apps. It's great for identifying, but pretty hard if you're trying to put it in the memory bank. And these are just a few of the wildlife that you might be able to see while you're traveling in Grand Teton and Yellowstone as well. So in a future photography webinar, you might see me talking about some of these fantastic, charismatic megafauna. So as promised, I want to just do a really quick look at the itinerary before we go to questions. So please think of your questions. I'm happy to answer questions about technology, about flowers, about what it's like to be in these places. So here's the itinerary. It's a 7-day trip. You either start in Bozeman on the north side of the park, or you start in Jackson, which is inside or just south of Grand Teton National Park. It's a really wildlife viewing heavy trip. So you're doing a lot of traveling around, looking for the wildlife, and also getting a chance to explore the geothermal features that Yellowstone has. So if you're starting on the south side in Jackson, day one would be exploring this area. So that day one is basically the welcome dinner, and you meet in Jackson. If you have extra days, I'd really recommend it here because we don't get to spend too much time in the Tetons. So day two is get to float the Snake River and do some wildlife viewing around the valley. Here we have a pronghorn on the left. And day three, we get up into Yellowstone National Park and spend some time with the geothermal features. And it's a really spectacular day. On the right, this is a picture of West Thumb Geyser Basin, where everything that you see there had erupted in a volcanic eruption. And then you've got a hot spring on the edge of Yellowstone Lake. Day four, we head to Hayden Valley and the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone River. Some really spectacular views, and a view that really shaped the history of why we were able to set Yellowstone aside. This particular location is where painter Thomas Moran did a really famous painting that inspired Congress and the nation to be able to set aside our first national park. Day five, we get to Lamar Valley, and this is really a big wildlife watching day where we spend some early mornings and put in as much time as we can to be able to see if we can find some of the more elusive wildlife. And day six, we're also in Lamar Valley doing the same thing, new areas, trying to see wolves, bear, bison, and just get some really nice moments like this one where you're just, along the river enjoying the amazing beauty and wildlife in this area. And then we make our way to Bozeman. And that night you have a farewell dinner and then get ready to depart the next day. So that's a very, very fast look at a really spectacular way to be able to explore the Tetons in Yellowstone. If you'd like to stay in touch with me, feel free to send me an email. Tell me what you thought about the presentation, or you can follow me on Instagram at Two Lined Studio. I'm a consultant when I'm not guiding, so I work with conservation groups to develop their photography and video and storytelling more broadly and web design. So I also have a project where I communicate around our peatlands, which are a really spectacular ecosystem. You can learn more on my website, twoline.com/peat, P-E-A-T. So thank you so much for listening, and I'd love to take some questions and find out what you're interested in hearing more about.
Charlie, thank you so much. That was so beautiful, all the colors and just how unique those flowers were. I didn't I didn't know what you were going to present to us today, and I'm completely in love with those flowers you presented, especially the shooting star ones. Like, what was that? That was beautiful. All right, everyone. We have quite a lot of time left. If you have any questions that you would like me to ask Charlie on your behalf, in your GoToWebinar control panel, there is a questions box. So go ahead and place those in there, and we will get through them with the rest of our time here. Alrighty, so to begin, in the vehicle, so like let's say that somebody is on one of our Yellowstone expeditions, do we have the dichotomous keys and or plant guides in the vehicles that people can use, or should they be prepared to bring their own?
Yeah, so each guide brings their own kit of resource books, and so that'll travel in the van. And this trip also travels through some of the best bookstores that will have what you need. But dichotomous keys are one that are tricky. And often guides won't carry it because it's kind of a specialty item that not too many people get jazzed about. So if you're interested in dichotomous keys, I would recommend looking up on Amazon like dichotomous key for Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, or it might even be Rocky Mountains, or your where you live. That one would be one if that strikes your fancy, you might want to bring one of those yourself. But there will be resources and guidebooks, and your guide will have a wealth of information to be able to share as well. Great question.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks for that. Okay, great. I know you did touch on it briefly, but we do have lots of questions about lenses. Could you go
Yeah.
into this maybe a little bit further in detail, especially when it comes to the macro lens? Do you have, what's your preference? What should people look at if they might want to get into this plant macro photography? Where should they begin?
Yeah, the chat about lenses is tricky because there are so many different factors that come into it. Um, there's the cost factor. That's one of the big ones. It's just how much money do you want to spend? And then that helps you set the guardrails of what you're looking at. So I always find, for me personally, it's always, all right, what am I budgeting? What am I willing to spend? Now let me look at that bracket of lenses and kind of decide within that which one is going to best suit my needs. When it comes to macro lenses specifically, this is very much a stylistic choice, and might potentially be something that uh, maybe it's a technical choice depending on what you're trying to do. But macro lenses are a quick guide to them is that they're going to be really specialized to capturing something very close to the lens. You're not going to be happy with this lens trying to shoot something that's even just 10 feet away or 100 feet away. It'll work, but not great. With that said, the macro lens that I have is a 105 millimeter from Nikon, a 2.8, and it's a really great Z series lens. It's fantastic. It has a specific distance that's the closest possible distance you can get from the subject to be in focus. But I find that it does really well. You know, even subjects 5 to 10 feet away, and I'll use it a lot as a portrait lens as well if I'm shooting, a portrait shoot with a person. Um, and that particular lens for me, it's bright all the way to the edge. Something you'll want to look at is if it creates darkness around the edges. Some macro lenses will do that. Some people prefer that. Some people like that. You can also edit that out in post editing. But really, what you're looking for is how important is it to be able to get really close to your subject, and then are you trying to magnify that subject, or are you trying to place that subject within a context? So there's some really interesting lenses out there now that I don't have that I would love to play with. Would be these what's called a probe lens. And a probe lens is actually going to, they look like these really narrow, long tubes that are like 2 feet long, and you can mount them on any camera system. Venus Laowa is the one that's kind of leading the charge on these. And it's a very specialty lens, but what's neat about it is kind of twofold. One is that it's a really wide angle macro, which means you can get super close to your subject and also get context of where your subject is. And these ones are waterproof up the barrel. So you could stick it a foot underwater to be able to photograph your subject. And there's a little light built into the lens itself that illuminates your subject. So those are a very, very specialty item where if you're really getting into it, you might go that direction. Another thing that people get really excited about in the macro world is I'm sure you've heard of focus stacking if you've looked into this at all. And basically, what that means is you'd want a tripod or incredibly still hands, and then you take a series of photos where you start with the item that's as close to the lens as possible in focus, and then shift the focus away and take a series of 100 photos perhaps, and then in software afterwards focus stack to bring them all together. And I'm getting a little bit of background noise on my end.
It might be my there's here, I'll go ahead and turn off my mic for now. They're doing a lot of just landscaping outside. So if it's
No
me,
problem.
I'll come back on. Just come back to me when you're ready, okay?
Yeah, I'll give you a heads up. Thank you. So with focus stacking, you're allowing software afterwards. There's a lot of different software you can use to be able to do that. Photoshop with Adobe products is one. Lightroom is starting to be able to do it as well. And then there's some specialty programs that I've never used that people who do this a lot are using. And that's gonna, when you look at some of the amazing macro insect photography where the entire bug is in focus, that's not possible with a single exposure unless you're using a telephoto pretty far away, and like, maybe in certain lighting conditions you might be able to get the whole thing in focus or the whole flower in focus depending on how you're setting it up. uh, but the focus stacking is really what's going to allow you to crisp up your image and ensure that all parts are equally in focus. So that's a pretty long answer to the macro side of things. Um, and from a wide angle, like my favorite lens right now is this 20 millimeter 1.8 Z series uh, Nikon lens. And when you get down into those numbers, you're starting to distort your image. So you're starting to see a tiny bit of fisheye. But with this lens, I don't notice it too much, and I can correct for that in post. And it also has an incredibly close focusing distance. So I can get really close to my subjects. In a lot of ways, it kind of acts like a macro lens because of that. So my suggestion, if you're looking at lenses, figure out your budget, look at what's available in that budget, and then go somewhere where you can test them out. A lot of these gear stores are more than happy to let you come bring your camera body and just try out different lenses in the parking lot, or maybe in their store if they have a little studio set up, and try and get into the conditions that are as close as possible to what you want to shoot. And then my last suggestion is, if you're maybe a little bit more serious and you don't mind spending a little bit of money, there are some services where you can rent a lens for a week and they'll ship it to you. You use it, you ship it back. And that way you can try something out. Maybe there's a specialty lens that you just wanted to get this one photo, but you don't want to make the investment of the whole lens. That can be a way to get around that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Um, and I've actually seen some photos from those probe lenses that you were just talking about. Like I ran a Earth Day photo contest for rewildology, and the winner was actually they used one of those probe lenses on salamander eggs, and it
Yeah.
was wild. So yes, I
That's mine.
recommend everybody look at the photos that come from this lens. It's crazy. They're so cool. I never heard or seen anything like it before, so I'm glad you brought them up. Just yeah, camera technology is coming very far.
Yeah.
All right, next, this is a good question. So let's say that somebody they're only going to come to Yellowstone one time. This is like the one trip that they have. What month should they consider to see as many things as possible? If yeah, when they're looking at booking a trip.
Yeah, that's the number one question that we always get, and it's always it's you're never guaranteed to see everything. To me, spring is a really neat time because wildlife are on the move, wildflowers are happening, temperatures aren't high. If you're someone like me that wilts in the heat, and you know you get the chance for baby bears, baby elk, all the babies. So for me, that early June time, the first week of June, is really special. And then, the other time that's really great for seeing wildlife is when the temperatures cool down again in the fall. Um, and so you're looking at kind of early October, late September, mid-September to late September. But what we are seeing in the national parks is just increased visitorship in the shoulder season. So uh, folks used to gravitate towards those times to avoid, high season, and summer is high season. Right now is some of the busiest time in the park. Uh, but the shoulder season, just know that expect to see quite a few people out there. Not the numbers that you'd see in the summer, but we are getting more and more people traveling there on the spring and fall. But for me personally, I love how green things are in the spring. If I could only pick one, I think I'd have to go with those first couple weeks of June. Yeah.
I second that. I've been in the spring and in the fall, which are both stunning times. I mean, any time in that area is absolutely beautiful, but as a wildlife freak as I am, yeah, wow. Spring is unbelievable. But any time is a good time. Whenever is available in your calendar, go. That's the best time to go.
That is true.
Great. Okay. Next, this is a good one too. We did not touch on iPhones or phones in general.
Yeah.
How do they compare, and do you recommend people having their phones available for wildflower photography?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think phone technology, camera technology has come such a long way, that when I get questions about packing for this trip, if you're with Natural Habitat Adventures or even if you're traveling alone, there's always this kind of battle of, I want all my lenses, but I don't want to carry all of them. I want to deal with the weight. And something that I recommend, landscape photography to me, unless you put in a ton of time and you're using a tripod, you're out at the perfect hour, you're thinking about where the light's going to be. Um, to me, I think a phone is going to do a really great job with those landscape shots. So for me, if I'm going to Yellowstone, I'm prioritizing the longest lens I have, and then thinking about my phone potentially being the landscape uh, camera. And then phones often, I've have a macro setting where it allows them to focus really close to the subject. Um, Play around. Some phones come with multiple lenses, and I've uh, do a couple tests where you do a macro shot where you're really up close, and then you do a shot where you're using a 5 times lens on your camera to be able to stand a little bit further away, but you're kind of cropped into the same place as you were if you're close up to the subject, and see which one you like better. Sometimes I prefer the longer lens effectively. And sometimes I like the really wide angle close up macro shot. Um, the other thing that I would say too is that when you're photographing flowers up close, often flowers are pretty bright, and so if you for an iPhone at least, if you tap on the photo, it'll show you a slider with the sun, that's your exposure. So I'll actually play with dropping the exposure down and just see how that feels with the photo, because every once in a while it'll kind of overexpose if it's a bright white flower and you want more detail in it. Um, so that's definitely something that I'll do. And then as stable as you can get. So especially in lower light conditions, sometimes our phones now are even saying like hold steady while it's taking a photo. That just means that it's doing a long exposure photo, um, and it does a few things to compensate for the fact that you're hand holding it. So it's actually cropping in and layering a bunch of photos on top of each other. But that kind of doesn't matter. What is important is trying to be as stable as possible. So all the same principles of taking pictures with your camera apply to your phone. If you can lean against something or use your elbows to stabilize and take a couple deep breaths, and then as you exhale or hold your breath, whichever one's more steady, take the picture. That can go a long way to making sure that your image is really crisp. Uh, I think those are the things I would think about with the phone. And then there are a couple things you can do if you use for Apple, it's called Live Photo. The symbol for it is kind of like a dot with a series of concentric circles coming out from it. If you turn that on, you take a picture, you can go into it. When you look at the photo, you go into the top left corner to a drop down, and you can select from a number of different things. One of them is long exposure. So say you have a flower and you have a river in the foreground or the background. If you select long exposure, it's going to blur any motion. So it's actually stacking a whole bunch of pictures on top of one another to be able to create that blurred effect. But that's kind of a fun hack for photographing waterfalls or rivers or trying to create the effect of a long exposure photo.
Wow, those are
Yeah, great question.
fantastic tips. Thanks so much for that. All right, I
Yeah.
do have a couple questions about, when this trip is and how much it costs and everything like that. Our adventure specialist team would be more than happy to answer those questions, and I would be happy to get you in touch with them too, or you can reach out to the team. But just let us know at webinars@nathab.com. But with that, we only have about 30 seconds left, Charlie. That absolutely flew by. So I will turn it to you for any last closing comments.
Just a second, just as I lose that a little bit. Let me get back into it. Thank you. So I do have a couple upcoming webinars. I'm going to be interviewing a couple of really fantastic expedition leaders who are pro photographers. That'll be on August 29th and September 16th. So you can tune in with that. One of those photographers is based in Canada, so we'll be doing a lot of polar bear and various Arctic photos with that. These photos here are not relevant. Those are just my photos. And then the other September 16th, I believe, is going to be South African wildlife, so the big five, and going into that. So tune in for those, and thank you for tuning in, and stay in touch.
Yes, absolutely. I'm very excited for those webinars. The two special guests are frequent presenters on Daily Dose, and they are fantastic. So I'm sure you're going to crush an absolute awesome interview with them. I cannot wait for those webinars, Charlie. Again, thank you so much for presenting to us today, and I would like to thank everybody who tuned in. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links on our website at nathap.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.